Hiya, welcome back, and if you're new, welcome too. I hope you're keeping safe and well, and if you'd like a reading with me, do check out the details below. And if you really like what I do, consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Alrighty, Hinsters, so this video is a request video from Foxy Sunrise, so thank you very much for that, Foxy Sunrise. I love the name, by the way. So Foxy Sunrise made the request in a comment on my Venus in Capricorn video, which, by the way, I recommend you go watch if you have not yet, so as to get Venus's side of the current astrology and the cosmic conversation. And also because that transit is going to last until officially February 1st, 2021. Foxy's question was on degrees and decans, or decans, however you want to pronounce it, in astrology. So I'm going to give my current working take on this with reference to this chart that you see here, so that you also get more of a visual. So you can see that this particular chart has the 12 zodiac signs symbolized in the outermost ring. Then you can see that within each sign there are lots of tiny lines and 3 longer lines. These lines are what mark the degrees, all of these lines. One thing we also need to know is that we are moving anti-clockwise here. When we read these circular charts, we're moving anti-clockwise. So and also, each sign, if you can see, is made up of 30 degrees or divided into 30 tiny slices. But each sign does not begin with 1 degree or the degree number 1, but actually it begins with 0 degrees. And so each sign, therefore, does not end in 30 degrees, but with the 29th degree. Before proceeding to the 0 degree of the following sign. I hope that makes sense. The first thing also I want to say in this video is that I'm about to skirt over and grossly simplify the history of it all, but if you are interested in a deeper, more just look at all of this, and you like books and history and you like academic writing, then I highly recommend the first, I think it's the first chapter, maybe the second, of Chris Brennan's book Hellenistic Astrology, the study of fate and fortune. But basically this beautiful birth chart, which is just the chart for a day here in London, by the way, but this chart that we see, it didn't magically start out looking like this. It wasn't produced either by one historical specific figure who set the standard for what astrology would be. This chart you're looking at, which is probably the most common format that my Hinsters here are familiar with, it's only actually the Hellenistic take on astrology. So yes, this chart we're looking at essentially came out of empire, and its popularity is thought to have peaked also at the peak of that particular empire. Most of us read charts or we hear astrologers talk about the zodiac signs and the houses and the degrees as if all of these things are some Hellenistic given, without really knowing, perhaps, what astrology was before the Hellenistic Empire. I'm aware also that some people might disagree that pre-Hellenistic forms of interpreting the stars aren't quote-unquote real astrology, and that's fine, but I feel that's really due to the over-masculinized and quite scientificized, if that's a word, it is now, but that scientificized colonial approach to spirituality, which is an approach that doesn't tend to embrace things that are more fragmented or more complex or just more independent, things that are not necessarily evidenced either through writing or things that have not just, they've not dictated or placed as priority some hyper or powerful categorization or definition. Now, when we break this chart down that you see into 3 basics, these 3 basic things of the zodiac signs and the houses and degrees, and again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, you can look into it yourself if you're more interested in more. But we find here that these three elements come from different spaces, basically. So the zodiac signs, they come from Mesopotamia, sometimes referred to as Babylon, although that's not necessarily accurate. And the houses then, they are thought to have been devised during the Hellenistic time, and then different techniques and interpretations would be developed in later periods. The degrees, though, well, they are said to have come from pre-Ptolemaic or pre-colonial ancient Egypt. We could say then that the signs and the degrees don't even come from Hellenistic astrology, but were taken as part of a more consistent or empirical form of astrology, which would increasingly focus on the individual and less on the mundane or the collective astrology. But yes, we are interested today in just the degrees. These Egyptian degrees would be used by the Hellenistic astrologers to mark divisions of the zodiac signs, or decans, as the Hellenistic Empire would come to term them. The originative term, I believe, is Baktio, and I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. But this Egyptian use of degrees was not a numerical marking up of the 12 zodiac signs from Mesopotamia. The Egyptians had their own divisions of the sky and paid attention actually to over 30 different constellations, 30, which colonial Egypt and then the Hellenistic Empire later took a fancy to, but would dilute and integrate with those Mesopotamian 12 zodiac signs. So you get the meeting of the 12 signs and the meeting of the Egyptian degrees in this new space of the Hellenistic Empire. So what was lost in this was the fact that the original Egyptian 30-plus constellations were associated also with several different deities, showing us that there was clearly a more spiritual connection to the stars, to the land, the Nile, for example, and also religious festivals, than to simply connecting the stars for individual reflection. But anyway, the deities themselves, they were sort of discarded, and the degrees were kept. And sometimes we see and hear how later there were planets associated with ruling each of the 3 decans in each zodiacal sign. And a decan is one of the 10 degree segments making up each of the signs that you see in this chart. And so there are 3 decans in each sign. Hopefully, again, you can see that and it's clear. But this assignment of planetary rulers to each of the decans within a sign is sometimes referred to as triplicity. And so, for example, Mars is said to rule the first decan of the Mesopotamian sign Aries, and the Sun would rule the second decan of Aries, and Jupiter would rule the third decan of Aries. So this quite complicated approach assigns different planetary rulers to the decans depending on the sign in question. And this was developed, I believe, during the medieval period. So we do see here that there is at least a little more depth associated with the degrees and why we even use them, though it does assign decan rulership not to the Egyptian deities but to the planets themselves. We can see, perhaps, then, that Hellenistic astrology became a more empirical amalgamation of a small number of takes on the stars, which made use of degrees, but seemingly in a more arbitrary sense. The number that the degree is at, therefore, has generally become more important than the degrees and the Baktio themselves, and as with in many other instances of later Roman empirical culture, which would adopt astrology but then later sort of crush its popularity, numbers become much more focal, and this practice of Hellenistic astrology itself gets much more empirical. This is why astrologers will often say, not all astrologers obviously, but a lot of astrologers will say that a 29-degree placement is anaretic, at this sort of point where things are about to spill over, explode, or where the energies of the sign that this degree is in are the most saturated, almost like having a mini full moon culmination. I just made a video, by the way, on new moons and full moons. If you're interested, you can check that out. Some astrologers also might say that, for example, 15 degrees represents the most concentrated amount of that zodiacal energy because it's in the middle of the sign. And again, some other astrologers might say that really early degrees, like 0 or 1, demonstrate brand newness or immaturity when it comes to mastering that particular zodiacal energy. And even that the person, if this is a person's chart, has come into this life to learn the lessons of that particular zodiac sign. Again, if you believe, of course, in past lives and reincarnation. Numerology has many other impacts on how astrologers interpret particular degrees, including the Roman empirical numerology that causes us to think January is the new year, yet it's Aries, the sign of the baby, of the spark, that marks the beginning of the astrological year. So there's also a dissonance there, due pretty much solely to empire. Ultimately, and I'm always learning and adapting my practice, so this is not me trying to say that this is, anything absolute. But, there is this temptation to read this chart that you see here on the screen, or any other chart like this, without any knowledge or acknowledgement of where certain things, parts of the chart, come from, or why we use certain things even. The North and the South Node, for example, where did they come from? And why are they sometimes just called Rahu and Ketu? This is something I believe, again, from a whole other part of the world, India, traditionally. So there's these things to think about as well. I guess what I'm saying is that the degrees have root in less colonial and masculine forms of divination, and are of a pre-Hellenistic astrology, of which there are many forms. And I am just suggesting here that there are so many other layers to spiritual astrology that readings of these charts that we see sometimes ignore or just get wrong. And I'm not saying that we should discard the numbers either, or the degrees in our reading of these charts, because, we are in the age of Aquarius, and there is a need for progression and more need for using higher systems and actually, moving away from the outdated, yes, but we also need to perhaps look back to these Bhaktyo and these deities and appreciate that this offers much more in terms of layers to understanding spiritually what is going on, what has been going on, and what is still going on, but is perhaps buried under very modern or contemporary terminologies and techniques that don't often acknowledge what has been buried. So that's kind of what I've come to just say on that topic. I hope it was of some interest or use to someone. And to Foxy Sunrise, of course. I will be back with another video soon, and I wish you a lovely hump day. And I hope, of course, in this pandemic that you are remaining to stay safe and well. And again, check out my details below if you would like a reading with me. Take care. I love you. Bye-bye.